There are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen, as so the saying goes, and this is certainly true for the final week of January 2025.
In the weeks leading up to recording this episode, we had plans to talk about Stargate, OpenAI, Oracle, and Softbank's $500 billion AI investment. We will, but in a very different context, because, unless you've been under a rock, you'll know that today's episode has to be all about DeepSeek.
To say the Chinese large language model has caused an upset in the market would be an understatement. Within days of its release, it wiped more than $1 trillion off the US stock market, sending big tech into a public meltdown.
But where did DeepSeek come from? And what does it mean for the future of the AI sector? You're listening to the IT Pro podcast.
Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Rory Bathgate.
Today, in conversation with IT Pro's news and analysis editor Ross Kelly, we're exploring the profound implications of DeepSeek. Ross, welcome to the show.
Good to be back. A rare podcast from the office.
So, Ross, for those who don't know, can you set the scene a little bit with DeepSeek?
Yeah, so last week, obviously the roof was blown off Silicon Valley to an extent with the release of DeepSeek's new models, V3 and R1. Both of these models have really blown people away, essentially. R1 in particular, has been positioned as a direct competitor to OpenAI based on, its reasoning capabilities. Things really picked up pace over the weekend, and it was on Monday this week that we saw things, I don't want to say spiral, but yeah, kind of get a tad out of control.
I have to ask, I'd never heard of DeepSeek before this week. So we are recording on the 29th of January, and until everything kicked off on Monday and carried on kicking off on Tuesday, I just never heard of this company. So is it that I haven't been paying attention? I know they're Chinese, say, are they the Chinese equivalent of Mistral, the French AI company, or are they a complete stalking horses come from nowhere?
I think there's a combination of sort of factors there. A lot of people paying, very detailed attention to the sector will have had, an understanding of DeepSeek and what they're doing, what they've been up to. But for a significant portion of, the global tech industry and tech enthusiasts, I suppose, they really have seemed to come out of nowhere. I think that's what's made it so impactful, that all eyes have been on Silicon Valley consistently for the last 2 years of this generative AI race, and then all of a sudden a plucky startup from China comes out of nowhere and sends everyone into a bit of a meltdown.
I think something it's important to add here is that some analysts from Gartner had said that they've been tracking DeepSeek since sort of mid-2024. You get bragging rights for that, but as Ross has just said, there are so many AI startups. And a clip that a lot of people have been sharing around semi-humorously in the last few days is a clip from 2023 where an Indian journalist asked Sam Altman, what's the worry, what's the concern that a startup in, say, India or China could rival you within the next 2 or 3 years? And he had kind of shot them down and said that the compute demands cannot be met, so that's not a concern for us. It's not going to come from that sector. It's gained a lot of traction, and it kind of highlights the issue of, even if you were tracking this company, you're tracking dozens, and it's kind of, I think it definitely has put the fear in some big tech companies that any one of these dozens could be sitting on kind of the next big breakthrough.
What is it they say about pride coming before a fall? It's just incredible hubris. So who were the big losers of the week? So as we said, things went a bit into meltdown. That's not just the tech community, but their stocks also started spiraling completely.
So yeah, NVIDIA, a big, I don't want to say loser here because, there's signs that there's rallying going on in the markets, but NVIDIA dropped around 17 points, losing almost 600 billion in market value. Broadcom as well, equally down around 17 points. A lot of the infrastructure companies here in particular, or, your hardware manufacturers, this is largely due to the fact that DeepSeek appears to have found, a way to really eke a lot of efficiency out of the hardware that they're using. which is the really impressive bit about this that I'm sure we'll go on to discuss. But yeah, when you look at these, manufacturers, chip makers, they've really taken a pounding this week. But I mean, equally, Meta, Microsoft, they slid, so did Google. But yeah, I think it just really shook people up. And we talked about degree of hubris there for US markets to go, what is going on? It seemed a lot of investors got really spooked by this.
We can go into the technicality of it in a second, as you say, but I think the main thing here, and the reason why NVIDIA in particular, but also Broadcom and ASML, is worth talking about why they are, because NVIDIA is very obvious. The orthodoxy has been that in order to train larger, more powerful LLMs, you need to have more and more and more and more infrastructure, and that's not what happened. So NVIDIA, which is behind this kind of, more is more, it's very obvious why they dropped by 17%. Broadcom, I messaged you, Rory, saying I don't understand why this is happening, but they make application-specific integrated circuits, so they kind of adding into the infrastructure behind the AI software. And similarly, ASML, they make lithography machines for advanced chips. So it's a multi-tier incident, if you like. But as we noted, these stocks are now rallying. So everybody's managed to kind of get some smelling salts and pull themselves together a bit.
Yeah, if your Twitter is anything like mine, over the last day and a half, you've seen a lot of arguments from people saying, it's over, this is the beginning of the end. And other people saying, no, this is the dip, buy the dip. Nvidia's gonna rally in the next few days. If anything, this is good for Nvidia. This is the kind of chatter you get around a big event like this. I think anyone who is professing to know which way the stock is going to go right now, I might caution them against that, because I think that what we've been shown over the last few days is that it's anything but certain.
I mean, if you're taking your investment tips from Twitter, X, yeah.
I take mine from Blue Sky and Reddit, personally.
I was about to say the exact same. Yeah. Wall Street Bets on Reddit is the place to be if you want to lose money.
Yeah, hang on. I'm just going to have a rummage in my sofa for some spare change to buy in the dip as well for NVIDIA, because putting this in perspective, it's still a massively valuable company, even after it lost 70% of its market value. Anyway, the bit that we've been teasing, how did DeepSeek do it? So what did they do? Rory, Ross mentioned that they had managed to sort of eke out all the power that's in the hardware that they had. So how does that work?
So as you might be expecting, it's a very complex picture. I've spent the last few days looking over the research PDF that they released, because this is an open source model. Anyone can check their working, and it's on GitHub. You can run it for yourself and check it for yourself. It's kind of a mixed approach. The one that's got the most coverage maybe is that they managed to use, and we'll talk about this in a little bit as well, relatively low power chips very, very efficiently. So there is an import ban on specific NVIDIA chips for China, and that's specifically imposed by the US for geopolitical reasons. Among them, concerns that China could advance very quickly with AI, given the right hardware. So DeepSeek has got around that, partly by really, really efficiently using memory. So for example, within the model, they used 8-bit floating point integers instead of 32-bit to kind of explain what that means. It's like if you were measuring numbers with 32 decimal points afterwards. That's a very, very accurate number. If you're doing it with 8 decimal points, on paper it's less accurate, but in practice, that's still quite an accurate reflection of what the number is. It's a kind of good enough method. And through a series of very complex new approaches to neural networks, to reinforced learning, DeepSeek also has kind of perfected a way to only expose the model, if you like, to a specific number of parameters. They've basically figured out, hey, instead of doing these giant, incredibly intensive training runs, how about we just identify the most efficient things it would be to train this model on and train it on those. It kind of cuts down that need to do those incredibly compute intensive runs. Something else that R1 uses is a mixture of experts system. So what this essentially means is, although the model is 671 billion parameters, so it's quite a large LLM, only around, I've seen a figure of 37 billion, and I think that's for V3. It probably varies, but only a chunk of those will ever be active at any point. And the chunk that is active is the one that is pertinent to the task you're doing. So if you input a math problem, the model is able to go, okay, activate this part of the model, which also means it's very performant without being clunky. You get low latency responses. It's just a very, very efficient way of inferencing on the model. So yeah, a mixture of new algorithmic approaches, new deep learning approaches, and some hardware trickery to kind of eke every possible bit of performance out of the model.
I mean, it's one of those things, as you're describing it, it just seems super obvious that you should do it this way. But I guess it's one of those things where scarcity breeds efficiency. Many listeners will be aware that there are some trade embargoes on China from the US, and this does include some AI chips. So officially, DeepSeek used 2,000 NVIDIA H800 chips, which are legal to import for China. However, in 2023, so before this trade embargo came in, Liang Wenfeng, who is the main financier for DeepSeek and is his CEO, said that his hedge fund had stockpiled A100 GPUs before the trade ban. What is the importance of all this, Rory?
So this is the kind of controversial part. The big stock market shock in the last few days, the reason that the reaction has been so severe, as you pointed out earlier, as Ross mentioned with Broadcom and you said with ASML, is it kind of decouples the more is more approach that companies have been taking to AI for the past few years. So NVIDIA has enjoyed such market success because it's kind of the sole producer of chips that kind of meet the compute requirements to train AI. That's been their main selling point is you need to keep buying our chips and you need to keep building bigger and bigger AI data centers and AI compute clusters to train fancier and fancier models. In making the claim that using relatively underpowered chips, specifically chips that China can still import, not even the frontline flagship chips that NVIDIA is using today, in making the claim that using just those, DeepSeek has been able to make a model that rivals some of OpenAI's best models, it's scared a lot of investors because it throws into question that whole approach. The reason there's controversy around this is some people are throwing into doubt the honesty of the claim that DeepSeek is making, that it did just use those underpowered chips. So as you point out, Liang Wenfeng made this claim in an interview on Chinese social media in 2023, was talking about stockpiling chips. It's unclear if that was for this or there have been some suggestions that that could have been for separate financial activities, because these chips are also really good for predictive analytics in the finance sector. We've also had some even bigger claims. So for example, Alexander Wang, who's the CEO of Scale AI, went on CNBC to claim that DeepSeek had access to 50,000 A100 GPUs that were stockpiled in direct contravention of the import ban. He hasn't provided any evidence for that claim. And there's a kind of ongoing argument now with people saying, okay, maybe they have a larger cluster that we don't know about. Maybe they're kind of blurring the truth a bit when they're saying it was just these 2,800 chips. And also those who are saying, okay, but you can't now come out and say, actually, it was all because they had so many more of our chips than they're claiming. It comes across as a bit of a sour grapes argument from some of the big AI companies in the US. It sounds to some critics a bit like they're mad and they're having to make up excuses for why actually DeepSeek isn't as good as they're claiming. So it's a very, very tricky kind of spot.
So Ross, R1 is the DeepSeek product that kicked off all the excitement last week and this week. V3 is the model on which it is based. Allegedly, it was made for $6 million. Is that likely?
I think there is tactical framing here to an extent. There's no doubt that this has been built, at a significantly cheaper cost compared to, what a lot of organizations in America, compared to a lot of organizations in the US and the West perhaps have been doing. But I mean, the V3 paper, specifically mentions that those costs only include the official training of DeepSeek V3. And, it goes on to quote excluding the costs associated with prior research and ablation experiments on architectures, algorithms, or data. So there is an argument to be made there. This has been made on a shoestring budget for sure, but there are other associated costs there. So it's not as if it's just been bootstrapped in a garage somewhere.
So it'd be like me turning around and going, hey, I got this pen free in WH Smith. All I had to do is buy these other 2 pens, get to WH Smith, buy the random piece of chocolate that they want to sell to me, and get back home again. So if we ignore the extra 15 and 20 quid that I spent, then it was free.
Yeah, and then you take into account staffing costs and other various associated costs there, and then it is going to add up. But I mean, regardless, I think it is still very impressive. Even if you were to combine all of those costs, I would hazard a guess and say that it's been still significantly cheaper compared to what, say, OpenAI has poured into model development, or perhaps Anthropic, or any of your big tech companies in the US.
So, Rory, you mentioned earlier that Sam Altman, who is the CEO of OpenAI, shot down the idea that anybody from China or India or any of the BRICS could come up with an idea that would rival OpenAI. This doesn't seem to be such a laughing matter now, or something to scoff at. Does DeepSeek scare OpenAI?
I would be surprised if DeepSeek didn't scare OpenAI, to be honest. I think, we talk about some of the biggest losers of the past week in terms of market cap. That's what we can measure. Obviously, OpenAI isn't measurable in that sense. But OpenAI was undoubtedly one of the biggest losers of the past week, mainly because while for the past year there have been models, Meta's Llama, Alibaba's Qwen, which have kind of come for the raw benchmarking titles that OpenAI originally got with things like GPT-4, OpenAI then pivoted to reasoning and said, but 01, 03, we've got the reasoning crown. Now we know that regardless of how much the budget was, evidently on a lower budget, because they haven't poured billions of dollars into producing DeepSeek V3, you can do reasoning too. And I think it's also open source, which undermines OpenAI's route to profitability as well, because I put out a post on LinkedIn on Monday saying, when all the dust settles around this, there's a lot of questions to be answered. But ultimately, what OpenAI will be worrying about is if you can do reasoning, if you can do good enough reasoning cheaply, why wouldn't you? And I think a lot of companies now will be going, maybe when GPT-5 comes out, it'll be a bit better. Do we need the most advanced model, or should we just get this free one off GitHub and it will do the job enough? So I think, it really undermines their whole profit model. And I think it also kind of blows a hole in their narrative. I mean, we'll get onto Stargate, but the narrative that Altman's been peddling for the past year of, did I say billions? I meant trillions of dollars that we need to produce the best AI. It really kind of blows a hole in that argument.
Yeah, because some of the most recent pronouncements that we've had from Altman has been all like, how we did this super premium tier, actually, we're not charging enough for it. We're still losing money hand over fist.
And I think that's, there's a bigger issue at play there as well around, what Rory mentioned around models like Meta have produced with Llama, coming for OpenAI specifically and targeting those benchmark wins. Everybody's been focused on each other. It's just been a one-upmanship sort of situation for the last 2 years in Silicon Valley. Google releases something, and there's that sort of running joke where when, Google's getting ready to make a big announcement, OpenAI comes in and, takes the wind out their sails in the AI space. And so, everybody's been just hyper-focused on what's going on in like the Bay Area. There's been a lot going on elsewhere in the world. There was a bit of excitement with Mistral. Remember when, they first burst onto the scene? I remember a lot of people talking about, wow, this could be like a European counter to OpenAI and Anthropic. And there was a lot of excitement around that, but then it all died down a little bit. And now we've seen an even bigger, even more impactful situation unfold, and people are, just losing their minds over this.
It's interesting that you use the phrase rest of the world. So I've seen this described as the Sputnik moment. So from the Cold War, nobody saw it coming that the Russians were going to be the first ones to get a working satellite into space. We'll come on to living cosmonauts and astronauts maybe another time. But it really has rocked everybody. Do you think that that is a fair comparison, or has the media, of which we are part, got a little bit carried away?
I think it is fair. I mean, Rory, I'm sure you'd agree. You need to remember what happened after the Sputnik situation, though. It was, again, a game of one-upmanship between the USSR and the United States and the West. I think we will potentially see that between US and Chinese-based companies in years to come. The US came up with the Gemini program and the Apollo program, and I think we're going to see that newer model outdoes it, newer model, rinse and repeat. I think the concerning thing for perhaps US companies, though, is that look at what Chinese companies have been able to achieve on the budgets they have, and they don't necessarily play by the same rules. So I think that might be a concerning sort of point for a lot of execs and a lot of AI companies and startups in the US.
Yeah. And I mean, you may point at Gemini and Apollo and the lunar landings and so on, but I'd also point at the fact that for a very long time, until SpaceX, it was Soyuz rockets and Arianes that were servicing the International Space Station. So
that's true.
Worth adding here, I was at Google Cloud Next last year, and I specifically asked one of the lead devs on Gemini if they were consciously nodding to the Gemini program in naming it Gemini, and he said that they were, and it felt like a precursor to precursor to the kind of advanced model, which would be Apollo. Not saying that Google would necessarily name it that, but it's definitely meant to evoke that.
Call it Orion instead.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like all of the Sputnik and space race comments, I agree with Ross. These are accurate. They're more accurate for capturing the mood, I think, than anything else, because these tech companies have convinced themselves that they are essentially NASA, that they are going to reach that kind of fated moment of artificial general intelligence or just the most profit that you can generate from AI. I think what's a bit different here is that relative to the amount of funding, and we'll get onto funding in a sec, relative to the amount of funding that's actually gone into the combined, models of OpenAI, Anthropic, even including things like Mistral, which have received billions in funding, DeepSeek's, even if you look underneath the claims and say, well, it's probably a larger number, it's a bit more like if post-war Britain had turned around and said, oh, surprise, we're sending someone to the moon. They're on their way right now, and the whole rest of the world had gone, what? We didn't even know you had a space program. I think, not to undermine the work that Chinese researchers are doing in AI, but again, to come back to that point of no one really knew where to look. It's not like there's one standout Chinese company that is the equivalent to OpenAI that everyone was kind of waiting to see if they would get there first. It's definitely caught people by surprise.
Turning back again to OpenAI and the question of whether or not they are concerned by DeepSeek and what they've done. Apparently, Mark Chen, the chief research officer at OpenAI, has said that DeepSeek's research paper demonstrates that they have independently found some of the core ideas that OpenAI did on their way to O1. So that's their newest version. But as you pointed out, Rory, there's no way to prove whether or not this is true because OpenAI doesn't share its research. It is not open source, whereas DeepSeek is very much, hey, come and look around, check out what we've done. Bloomberg has also reported that OpenAI is claiming that it has evidence, once again, it hasn't shared yet, that DeepSeek used its models to train R1. So, as I say, OpenAI hasn't presented this evidence yet, assuming it has it. But whether or not it has, to play devil's advocate a little bit, is this an ironic protest on behalf of OpenAI, given that they have very much relied on open access to all the information in the world and have argued that everything should be available free?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of righteous indignation here, shall we say. OpenAI has been absolutely trawling the web for a couple of years now, and it's no secret either. How many lawsuits are there On the go at the moment. Yeah, I mean, I've looked at Rory there, and a look of there's a couple, but at the very least, there's maybe a bit of a tactical play here from OpenAI and saying this is a really great achievement by them, but we think we're actually the real winners here. We're the victim, but we're also going to be the winners here. Very Trumpian in its style, I guess you could say. We lost, but we won bigly.
Actually, we won, yeah.
I think OpenAI kind of has no other option here. It's sort of what you would expect them to say. I think it's worth mentioning here. I mean, in the introduction, we kind of teed this up. Stargate.
What is Stargate other than an excellent 1990s sci-fi film and television series?
So Stargate is a landmark announcement, I'll say, because right now the actual reality of the project is very much in doubt. It's an announcement made by Sam Altman, CEO at OpenAI, Larry Ellison, CEO at Oracle, and Masayoshi Son, the CEO of SoftBank, announced that they were pulling together $500 billion, $500 billion of investment into a giant compute cluster to train AI models. They're going to build it in Texas. They've announced 10 projects that are on the way right now. And I think they said they were looking for an initial 10 more. And these would essentially form a giant training cluster for frontier AI models. A lot was made about that. And like I said in the introduction, I had expected that that's what we would be talking about this episode because I hadn't seen this is last week. Obviously, the big reaction over DeepSeek hadn't happened yet. So it's definitely taken the wind out of their sails on that. At the time, there was a lot of back and forth over whether they had the money. Elon Musk waded in and said, I have on good authority that they don't have 500 billion to spend on this project. And yeah, I think Musk also has obviously a horse in this race because xAI has just built its own giant data center with I think 100,000 H100 GPUs. Again, going in on the argument that more is more, that you need these giant infrastructure projects to leverage the future AI models. So I think there is a fear in those statements. Actually, you ended up just validating our model, and our model was trained on this giant cluster, and therefore we need another $500 billion to deliver the next thing. It's definitely thrown that into doubt.
Yeah, I do not know what the Department of Government Efficiency would think about, spending 500 billion while startups in China are bootstrapping this. I think there'd be a lot to say there.
So one person who can be said to have taken all of this quite calmly is Satya Nadella, who posted a link to the Wikipedia page for the Jevons paradox on X following the market reaction. And he wrote, Jevons paradox strikes again. As AI gets more efficient and accessible, we will see its use skyrocket, turning it into a commodity we just can't get enough of. Do you think that this take is this a good take? He seems very upbeat about the whole thing.
For those who don't know, Jevons paradox is the idea that as something gets more efficient, while the short-term reaction might be, oh, we actually need less of this because it's more efficient, what that actually does is it drives the market because it becomes cheaper to do the thing. So it comes from a case in which a new coal engine came out. So it was like, oh, coal demand will go down because it more efficiently uses the coal. But what it actually did, of course, was massively drive up coal use because now it was cheaper to run things on coal. So more companies were using it. So what Nadella is saying here is if it's cheaper to run AI, that will actually increase demand for GPUs and increase demand for data centers because it's more accessible and every company will want to be doing it. I think it's a hopeful reading of it. I think we are likely to see something like this. And a line that we have to draw here is between training and inference, right? DeepSeek is cheaper to train. It's also much cheaper to run than a lot of the models. And the majority of AI data centers aren't there to train models. They're there to inference them. They're there to run them whenever someone puts a prompt in. So there will be always inferencing demand. Even if AI becomes less compute intensive to train, once it's trained, you still need to run it somewhere. there will always be those inferencing demands. And something I did just want to mention, which is an area of interest to watch, and maybe something we'll do a podcast on in the coming months, is while DeepSeek used some NVIDIA chips, depending on who you ask, they either use A100s or H800s, but they definitely use NVIDIA chips to train it. They're not inferencing on NVIDIA chips. They're inferencing on Huawei 910C chips, which are made in China. And they are, while they're not entirely reliant on Chinese supply chain yet, because as we mentioned earlier, lithography machines come from Europe, China's working on that too. So there's also a bit of home pride here and a bit of national security implications for China, where of course it wants to secure its own supply chain for chips and not at all be reliant on companies like NVIDIA. So the inferencing picture is interesting here because, as Nadella's pointed out, the inferencing is going to continue to drive growth in the AI space. And that's kind of where we'll need a lot of this investment to be going anyway. And also, DeepSeek is already proving an interesting model for Chinese chips being very much good enough for inferencing an advanced model.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. But Ross, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be back. Great to be back at the office with Rory as well. A rare occasion.
As always, you can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes and even more on our website at itpro.com. You can also follow us on LinkedIn as well as subscribe to our daily newsletter. Don't forget to subscribe to the IT Pro podcast wherever you find podcasts, and if you're enjoying the show, let us know by leaving a rating or a review. We'll be back next week with more from the world of IT. But until then, goodbye.